Hi again, and welcome to part 2 of the SkyX class. In this section we're going to be learning about the sky chart windows, where to find them and how to use them. So when I say sky chart window, what I mean is that if you look under this display menu, you see a section down here called sky chart windows. And there's another section called imaging system windows. We'll do that in another episode. But under this sky chart windows, there are these various things: chart elements, chart status, date and time, labels, observing lists, all these things. Most of these we don't use too much, but the ones we do use we're going to take a deep dive into. But in case you ever lose one, let me show you how to get it back. So for example, if I say the date and time, somebody closes this window, it's not there anymore. You go to the display menu, you go down to date and time, and it reappears. Now it may not reappear in the same order that it was. These tabs are movable. I can move it up and down. So if you need to do that, you can do that as well. Okay, so let's look at the ones we use. So we talked about date and time in the introduction. The first thing I want to do is make sure that this box is unchecked. Prohibit all time changes. I don't want to prohibit all time changes. I want to set a specific time. And I'm going to choose midnight. I'd like to choose midnight because I use that as the transit time for things that are going to be very viewable that night. Now I want to pick a date. So the date is currently on March 21st. There are two ways I can change it. I can edit this up here, or I can just click down here in the calendar and go to March 24th. The same with the time. You can edit the time. You can also advance the time if you want to see how things change and how they move. I usually use 1000x. I'll show you what that does. So if you push this button to go forward, you can see the chart increments in individual steps, and you can see, let's say, M44 going down toward the horizon. If you want to see a longer evolution, you can just push go forward and it'll run continuously until you stop it. So we'll stop it and we will return to our specific time of midnight. Now I don't particularly like this view that I have. I want to see where my horizon line is and what's up. So I'm going to go back to the Find window and put in Zenith. And it centers the chart. If it doesn't center it, you can always tell it to center. And now I can see everything that's up at midnight on the 24th. One thing I want to caution you about is when you take actions like this, when you go into the chart and you edit something, I don't understand it myself, but it's common for this time to get reset to the current time. So always go back and check it before you run anything, like create an observing list. Okay, so you just saw Find. So Find is useful. You can type in object names. For example, M31. If we click Find and you see M31 appears there, it gives you the names, what type of object it is, right ascension and declination, under two different date systems, the current azimuth and altitude. The altitude, well, both of these are useful. Even though we have a German equatorial mount, this is useful to know how far above or below the horizon is. So you can see this is already below the horizon at midnight on the 24th. It tells you the magnitude of the object, the size of the object, when it rises, when it sets, when it transits. A lot of the other stuff is not so useful. Sometimes if you're doing photometry, there is some useful stuff down here. It gives you the Julian date. right now, and it also gives you, for stars, in particular double stars, it'll give you both magnitudes. It'll give you the spectral type, and actually you can look at a spectral diagram of many of the more famous stars. So, if you go to the Advanced tab, you can tell it what catalogs you want to use, right? There's a lot of catalogs, and in fact, it gets kind of overwhelming sometimes. It finds too many objects. If you search for something, stars in particular, but all these star catalogs, you can find so many different names for the same thing. So I usually don't mess with this, but it's there if you need to limit your search. So, other things on this tab. There's a frame. The frame is really what it's saying is if you push that button, it's going to center the sky chart on the area where M31 is, and it's going to zoom in the sky chart to an area to show M31. So let's go back and find M31. Well, it's already found, right? Even though there's nothing in the search bar, but we're still looking at M31. You can tell by the data here. So we're going to say, frame it. And there it is. And you can see that superimposed on this is the field of view indicator. So this is the field of view, this combination of camera and telescope. And so you can see that we clearly cannot get the whole Andromeda galaxy in this field. So we'd have to take a mosaic. Another topic for future. We also have this thing called Show Photo. And so if you click that, you get a photo, and you can see that there's multiple photos. We talked about that before. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. We talked about the difference between slew and closed loop slew. Slew just goes directly to the target, but it's not terribly accurate. Closed loop slew, first step is the same as a slew. It goes to where it thinks the target is, takes a picture, plate solves the picture, makes a final move so the target is perfectly centered. Copy text, you can copy this to a clipboard if you want to use it for something later to make a report or something like that. You can add it to an observing list if you wish. This lock-on button is mostly useful for planets. You can click on a planet and say lock on it, and then as you advance the time, the planet will stay centered on the screen and the stars will move past, instead of this planet always scrolling off the screen. So if you want to see how your object is moving through the background stars, it's useful. And the ubiquitous abort button to stop any slews. You find that on several screens, pretty useful. One thing that's also useful down here, you see related search results. So this is not a good example right now because we only have 2 search results, but let's say if I were to click on right here, this little other galaxy, M32, right? Then it has some other names. It has M31, NGC 224, all the names and things that are related to that. Occasionally it comes in handy to go back to something that you were looking at before, or it even has the most recent mouse click position. So, good for some things, just to be aware of. Main thing to watch out for is just because I type in M32 here and hit enter, it doesn't always take. So you really have to type that and look at this here and make sure that it came up. Many times the previous entry will still be there. So if it doesn't change, click this Find button and it will go to the right thing that's in the title box. Next up, I think we'll show the orientation menu. So I don't find this menu to be terribly useful. It has a look button which tells you can look different directions. So basically you can make it's not looking quite north, right? So you can tell it look north and it orients the chart to the north. Sometimes useful, but not that much. Zoom to. Again, you can go to something like binocular view, 50 degrees, and it zooms out. But I don't find it too useful because it never goes quite where you wanted it to go. It kind of picks its own place to go. I find these zoom buttons to be more useful. The terrestrial sphere and the celestial sphere, I think, are useful. That's why I have them as buttons on the toolbar. The difference is the terrestrial sphere shows the horizon. Now, it's currently set to terrestrial sphere, so you're asking yourself, well, where's the horizon? Well, if we zoom out, you'll see the horizon. There it is. And it just happens that for reasons of its own, the target is pointing north towards the north celestial pole. So in a normal view where you would want to point at the zenith, and then it would be looking more like you'd expect. So we'll do that again. And then you can see the horizon. Now if I switch to celestial sphere, you can still see the horizon line, but you notice the gray area went away. And so with this particular circular horizon, it still doesn't matter too much. But if I go back to this position, and I say the north celestial pole, and then I zoom in again, and I tell it to center, well, now there's the horizon line. Which side of it am I on? I can't tell. But with the terrestrial sphere, you can tell. Okay. Now, back here to the observing list. This one. This is a pretty useful one, and we're going to learn how to use it. So, first of all, let's check to see that we have our date and time still set at midnight. Yes, it's still there. So, you see there's nothing in the observing list. So how do we fill it? Well, we go to Manage Observing List. Now there's a button here called What's Up, and that is SkyX's kind of shortcut. It does a selection of objects that it thinks are useful. We'll click it just for fun. But what it does is it goes through the entire catalog. It finds things that are above the horizon, and it's going to make a list. But the list is going to be everything there is. Stars, clusters, dark nebula, quasars, anything, everything that there is. It's just an overwhelming list. It takes too long to pick through it. As you'll see this in a minute when it comes up. So what I like to do is this other one, Manage Observing List, because I can create the search criteria that I want to use, and we'll show you that in a moment. While we're waiting for this to finish, I just point out that it has these same buttons, the slew, the closed loop slew, copy text, and here you can also print the text, and you can add or edit an observation. So for, let's say, just this first object, there is a set of observation notes. And if I click add or edit, that comes up and I can put information in there. I'm not going to type anything because I don't want to say something useless, but you can use that to come back to later. Okay, so we've got a list here of what SkyX thought might be interesting tonight. And let's first of all see how many objects are in this list. So there's 333 objects. And let's look at some of their characteristics, and I'll show you why I don't think this is terribly useful. First of all, let's look at the size. This is the major axis. So a lot of these things are only 1 or 2 arc minutes. They're just specks on the screen. You really need something that's bigger than about 5 arc minutes to be interesting. So somewhere here we've just crossed off about 200 of the objects just because they're too small. Okay, so I can do that. I can delete them by pressing Shift and click. And I selected all those, and I can delete them from the list. Yes. So now I'm down to 136 objects. Great. Now we're going to look at the magnitudes. So we'll sort this by magnitude. Well, magnitude 3 is pretty bright, and magnitude 10 is reasonably bright. So okay, all of these, 11 is getting a little iffy, but we have a pretty big telescope, so we can live with that. Now let's look at rise time. All these things rise at midnight. That's the rise time. So they're probably no good to us because nobody's going to be here at midnight, right? To look at them. So we delete those. And then we have the set time. These things set at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, fine. 7, 8, 9. Okay, so those set times are all pretty good, as long as it rises soon enough. So now let's look at transit time. And so these are all close to midnight, you know, plus or minus an hour, that's good. This one's not good. It's going to be too low for us to look at. In fact, all of these ones, like between 2 and 3, are not good. Okay, so we have transit time again. Now we have transit times that are 7 p.m. Well, that means it's going to be getting pretty low, but maybe viewable. So now we're good. We have a pretty good list. And we still have 94 objects. Well, okay. It's an interesting exercise. You can do this if you wish. I find that it's still too many and that you have to go through them one at a time and decide if they would be interesting. So let's try an alternate method. We're going to click on Manage Observing List. And I have this query called Bright Objects Visible Now from RFO. If I double click on that, the query opens here and it says what's in it. Here are the list of catalogs it's looking at. And the selected object types. So it's not looking for every double star or every open cluster or anything like that. And it's looking for just some specific star catalogs, Hipparcos in particular. Important thing here, I think, is we've selected that the altitude is greater than 25 degrees. So when we're observing, we want that thing to be up above the horizon. We want the major axis to be less than 25 because that's the field of view of our camera. And we want the major axis to be greater than 3. 3 is a little small. I would usually use 5, but that's okay. And the magnitude less than or equal to 10. Now here you have to remember a smaller magnitude is brighter. So we're selecting numbers less than 10 because those are the brighter objects. So now we can run this query. So we come down here and run this advanced query. And you see it's progressing much faster. And I expect that this will produce a list of maybe 25 objects. So we're sort of done with this, but I'll save it for a moment. So you see it's gone down to the bottom of the screen there. So how many objects did we get? Well, we got 50. Okay, so this is still too many objects. So let's edit this query. In particular, we're going to go for bigger objects. So I go into the edit mode. I'm going to change that value to 10. Now you might wonder, why was it 3 in the first place? And that is because a lot of planetary nebula are small, like 2 arc minutes. So this query is not going to find any or very few planetary nebula. You can adjust this as you see fit. Just be aware that you're going to be digging through a big list the smaller you go. So let's run this. And I expect we'll get a much smaller list this time. And all of them should be useful items. Yeah, there you go. So what did we get? We got 19 items. Much more manageable. Of course, all of them are spiral galaxies, so you may want to hunt around, but anyway, you get the idea. Now there's a couple of things you can do here. One thing that you can do is under the Refine and Export tab, you have a thing called Remove Duplicates, because this table will have duplicates in it. It doesn't this time, but on occasion it will have duplicates. And the duplicates arise because, for example, M31 has an NGC designation and a Messier designation. You can also save as a text file. You can also save as a formatted text file for Excel. This is useful if you don't have a printer handy. You can export a file, save it on a memory stick, or email it to yourself. The formatting is not the best, but it's useful for carrying home the values so that you can read up on them and be ready to talk when you're running the telescope the next public night. The other thing you can do over here is you can print this table. If you have a printer attached, you can print directly. That comes out pretty well. I suggest landscape mode. Sometimes there's too many columns in the table. If there are, you can set up the report and remove some of the columns. So for example, if I wanted to remove rise time, just uncheck it here and it's gone. Okay, so that's how you format the report. So before we wrap up, I have one more important thing to show you, and that is the chart elements window. So here it is under the sky chart windows, under the display menu. Let's open it up. It gets added to the end of the list. It looks pretty unimposing at first, but it's actually a very full window. My object types we don't usually use. We don't usually use reference objects either, but we do use reference lines and photos. So this is where you find things like the constellation drawings, the ecliptic, the equatorial grid, the horizon, things like that, that get shown on this chart. There's no need to go through all of those in detail, but I do want to show you a couple things about them. So if we go up to stellar objects and we open that drop down, you see that there is something called star options. If you click that, you have some adjustments that you can make. More stars, less stars, halos, no halos, fuzzy, solid. This is kind of covering how the stars look on the screen. So if I, for example, put big halos, I don't care for them, but there they are. I can make them brighter, but I don't care for that either. Less contrast, more contrast. It's a bunch of stuff you can change. There's also a nice button here that says fill stars with spectral color. I like that. It's helpful that the stars appear more or less in their actual color. So that's one way to adjust star properties, but there's another way that I think is even more useful, which is you go to the line item and you double click on the line item. And it opens up this thing where you can set magnitude limits and angular size limits. So it's currently set to show stars no dimmer than magnitude 16. If I drag that down, you can see it eliminates a lot of stars. If I crank it up, it doesn't show much on this view, but if you zoom way in, you can see those dim stars. So let's leave it at 16. And the angular size limits, that doesn't really apply to stars. They don't really have an angular size. But let's see where it does apply. So if we go to non-stellar objects, things like galaxies, and you double click on them, now you can say I don't want to see any galaxies smaller than 1 arc minute. And I don't want to see any dimmer than magnitude 14. That's really useful because as you zoom in, all those tiny galaxies just fill the screen and the chart becomes almost unreadable. So generally we leave these alone, but I wanted you to know that they're there in case you need them. Now close this window so that it's not shown. Let's say that you get in here and you make some changes to this. What I'm asking you to do is, if you make changes like I just did, go to this place and say File, Save As. And you can save it as your own name, My Chart Settings. And the reason is, if you don't do that, it's going to automatically save everything that you did onto the default chart, which we don't want. We want always to have people come back to a default chart. So please do that for me. Now, if I want to get to the default chart, I can just open it and say, in this case, Chart Settings, and there's my default settings. This does not apply to some of the other stuff, the equipment that we're going to see later. We'll show you how to save that as well. All right, thanks everybody. See you next time.